As strange markings on an ancient blade start to reveal their secrets, a struggling farmer becomes so overwhelmed by the discovery that he breaks down in tears, realizing he's stumbled upon something far greater than himself. The sword he unearths in his field would not only unlock mysteries of a forgotten age, but lead him to a treasure beyond imagination. Farmer Michael Sullivan stood at the edge of his property, his calloused hands resting on the ancient stone wall that had marked his family's land for generations. His small farm in County Kerry, nestled between the misty mountains of Western Ireland, had been passed down through his bloodline since before anyone could remember. The morning fog was lifting, revealing the patchwork of fields that had sustained his family for centuries, each stone wall and hedgerow telling its own story of past harvests and hardships. The farm had once been the pride of the region, known for its rich soil and bountiful yields of potatoes, barley and wheat. Michael's grandfather used to tell tales of how the land was blessed by the old gods themselves, though such stories seemed like cruel jokes now. The past decade had brought nothing but struggles, with changing weather patterns wreaking havoc on traditional planting schedules and rising costs making it nearly impossible to compete with larger, more modern operations. Modern farming equipment sat far beyond his reach, with prices that might as well have been written in gold. The bank had already denied his loan applications twice, citing the farm's declining productivity. Even the local agricultural cooperative had begun to whisper about the Sullivan farm's uncertain future. Michael's daughter, studying agriculture at university in Dublin, had suggested selling the land to one of the big agricultural companies, but the thought of being the Sullivan who lost the ancestral farm kept him awake at night. Each morning, Michael would walk his fields before sunrise, just as his father and grandfather had done before him. He knew every inch of the land, every dip, every rise, every stubborn rocky patch that had broken plows for generations. The far corner of his property, a boggy section that had resisted farming since time immemorial, had always been particularly troublesome. Local legend spoke of it being cursed ground, though Michael had always dismissed such talk as old wives' tales. This spring had been unusually dry, the first in living memory that had left the boggy corner firm enough to consider farming. With bills piling up and the bank breathing down his neck, Michael couldn't afford to leave any part of his land unproductive. He had decided to risk breaking new ground, despite the warnings of old Tommy O'Brien at the pub about disturbing what should be left alone. The morning started like any other, with Michael aboard his father's old tractor, its faded green paint and rusted edges telling the story of decades of faithful service. The sun had barely crested the eastern hills when he began working the boggy corner, the tractor's engine protesting against the virgin soil. For hours, he methodically ploughed the untamed earth, his mind wandering to memories of better days. Then it happened. The plough struck something solid, producing a sound that rang out across the field like a bell. It wasn't the usual dull thud of stone against metal that he'd heard countless times before. This sound was different, clearer, almost musical. Michael's hands instinctively pulled back on the throttle, the tractor's engine quieting to a low rumble. In his 30 years of farming, he'd unearthed all manner of things: old coins, rusty tools, even a Victorian pocket watch once. But something about this sound made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Climbing down from the tractor, his boots sinking slightly into the freshly turned earth, Michael noticed an unusual glint in the soil that caught the morning light, in a way he'd never seen before. As he approached the spot, his heart began to race. There, partially exposed in the dark soil, was something that definitely didn't belong in a boggy Irish field. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he brushed away the earth, revealing what appeared to be the hilt of a sword. The metal seemed to pulse with an inner light, surprisingly untarnished despite its obvious age. Intricate patterns adorned the handle, unlike anything he'd ever seen in the local museum's displays of Viking or Norman artifacts. The moment his fingers closed around the ancient hilt, Michael felt something he couldn't explain. A connection, as if centuries of history were suddenly rushing through his veins. The sword seemed to hum with energy, and for a brief moment, he could have sworn he heard distant echoes of battle cries and clashing steel carried on the morning breeze. Little did Michael know that this discovery would not only unlock mysteries of ancient Ireland, but would also provide an unexpected solution to his struggling farm's future. The sword in his trembling hands was about to change everything he thought. He knew about his land, his heritage, and his destiny. The sword lay on Michael's kitchen table, catching the afternoon light that streamed through the window. He had carefully cleaned away the centuries of soil, revealing intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change as shadows played across the blade. The metal was unlike anything he'd ever seen, not the dull grey of iron or the yellow sheen of bronze, but something altogether different, with an almost bluish tinge that reminded him of the sky just before dawn. His grandmother's words echoed in his mind as he studied the remarkable weapon. She had always insisted their land held secrets from the old times, back when heroes and druids walked the hills of Kerry. As a child, he'd spent countless hours listening to her stories of the Fianna warriors who, according to legend, had used these very hills as their training grounds. He'd dismissed those tales as mere folklore. As he grew older, focused instead on the practical concerns of running a farm in the modern world. The kitchen walls around him told their own story of decline. Paint peeled from the corners, and the ancient Aga cooker hadn't worked properly in months, too expensive to repair or replace. Bills lay scattered across the counter, their red final notice stamps a constant reminder of his mounting troubles. The latest bank statement showed an account as barren as his fields had become, with barely enough to cover next month's expenses. Michael reached for his phone, his fingers hovering over the number for the National Museum in Dublin. It would be the sensible thing to do: report the find, hand it over to the authorities, perhaps receive a small finder's fee. But something held him back. The sword felt like it belonged here, as much a part of his land as the ancient stone walls that crisscrossed his fields. His daughter Kate's latest letter lay unopened beside the sword. He knew what it would say. Another carefully worded suggestion about selling the farm, moving to the city, starting fresh. She meant well, but she didn't understand. The Sullivan farm wasn't just land and buildings, it was 5 generations of stories, struggles and triumphs. Every stone in every wall had been placed by Sullivan hands, every field had been worked by Sullivan's sweat. The afternoon wore on as Michael examined the sword more closely. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the blade perfectly balanced, the hilt adorned with symbols that seemed familiar yet impossible to place. Some appeared almost like the old Ogham script he'd seen in history books, but others were entirely foreign. As he traced the patterns with his finger, the metal seemed to warm beneath his touch, as if responding to his presence. A knock at the door startled him from his reverie. Through the kitchen window, he could see Tommy O'Brien's battered red Land Rover parked in the yard. The old man had been the keeper of local history for longer than anyone could remember, his mind a repository of every tale and legend ever whispered in the pub or passed down through generations. Michael hesitated, unsure whether to hide the sword before answering. Tommy was trustworthy enough, but news travelled fast in small communities. Once word got out about his discovery, there'd be no keeping the authorities away. Yet something told him the old man might have answers to the questions burning in his mind. With a deep breath, Michael opened the door. Tommy's weathered face crinkled into a knowing smile. "I felt it, you know," the old man said without preamble. "The moment you pulled it from the earth, the old powers stirring again." He stepped past Michael into the kitchen, his eyes fixed on the sword with an intensity that suggested he'd been expecting to find it there. Tommy moved closer to the table, his gnarled hands hovering over the blade without touching it. "Do you know what you've found, Michael Sullivan?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't just any old relic for a museum shelf. This is the sword of Fionn McCumhale himself, or at least that's what the old stories would have us believe." Michael sank into a kitchen chair, his mind reeling. Fionn McCumhale was Ireland's greatest legendary hero, the leader of the Fianna warriors. His grandmother's stories had been full of his exploits, but they were just stories, weren't they? Tommy continued, his voice taking on the rhythmic quality of a practiced storyteller. "There's a reason your family has held this land for so long, Michael. A reason the Sullivans have been here since before records began. Your ancestors weren't just farmers. They were guardians, chosen to protect this ground until the sword revealed itself again." The old man's words seemed to make the air in the kitchen grow thick with possibility. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in the old windows with an almost musical sound. The sword on the table seemed to gleam brighter, as if responding to its story being told. "But why now?" Michael asked, his voice hoarse. "Why, after all these generations, would it show itself when the farm is on the brink of being lost?" Tommy's eyes twinkled. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "that's exactly why. The old powers work in their own way, Michael. They don't reveal their secrets to just anyone, and they don't do it without reason. The question isn't why the sword has appeared. It's what you're going to do now that it has." Michael sat alone in his kitchen long after Tommy O'Brien had left, the old man's words hanging heavy in the air. The sword still lay on the table before him, its mysterious markings seeming to pulse with an inner light as evening shadows crept across the room. His mind raced with possibilities, each more fantastic than the last, while his practical farmer's sense warned him against believing in children's tales. The weight of decision pressed down on his shoulders. By law, he knew he should report the find to the National Museum. There were strict regulations about archaeological discoveries, and the penalties for keeping such finds could be severe. The sensible course of action was clear. Contact the authorities, let the experts handle it, perhaps earn a small reward for his honesty. It would be enough to keep the bank at bay for a few more months at least. But Tommy's words about guardianship and ancient responsibilities wouldn't leave his mind. He pulled out his grandmother's old journal from the dresser drawer, its leather cover worn smooth by decades of handling. She had meticulously recorded the old stories, preserving tales that stretched back into the mists of time. Michael had always assumed they were just folklore, but now, with the sword before him, every word seemed to carry new weight. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned the yellowed pages. There it was, the tale of how the Sullivans came to this land. According to his grandmother's flowing script, their ancestor Diarmuid Sullivan had been one of the last members of the Fianna, the legendary warrior band led by Fionn McCumhale. When the age of heroes was ending, Diarmuid had been entrusted with protecting certain sacred sites and objects until they were needed again. "The sword will sleep in the earth," Michael read aloud from the journal, "until a time of greatest need when the old powers must awaken once more." He looked up at the blade on his table, its metal catching the last rays of sunset. Was this truly the weapon of legend? And if it was, what responsibility did that place on his shoulders? His phone buzzed, another text from Kate. "Dad, the agricultural advisor is coming next week. Please consider the offer from the development company. We need to be practical about this." Practical? The word seemed to mock him. What was practical about a magical sword appearing in his field? What was practical about being the descendant of legendary warriors? Standing up, Michael paced the kitchen floor, his mind working through every angle. If he kept the sword hidden, he'd be breaking the law. But if Tommy was right, if the old stories were true, then surrendering it to a museum might be breaking a far older and more important trust. The sword hadn't revealed itself to be locked away in a glass case. It had come to him, a Sullivan, on Sullivan land. The wind picked up outside, rattling the kitchen windows. Michael's eyes were drawn to the photographs on the wall, 5 generations of Sullivans standing proud on this same land. His father, grandfather, great-grandfather, all the way back to old black-and-white images of stern-faced men and women who had worked this soil before him. Had they known? Had they felt the weight of this guardianship even without understanding it? A sudden memory surfaced, his father's last words before passing. "The land knows its own, Michael. Trust in that." When times are hard, at the time he'd taken it as simple farmer's wisdom. Now those words carried a different resonance entirely. Moving back to the table, Michael reached out and grasped the sword's hilt. That same surge of connection he'd felt in the field rushed through him again, stronger this time. The metal warmed beneath his touch, and for a moment he could have sworn he heard distant sounds, horses' hooves clashing steel, ancient war cries carried on the wind. His phone buzzed again, this time with a call from the bank. Michael let it ring out. The choice before him wasn't just about a historical artifact or his struggling farm anymore. It was about heritage, about responsibility, about keeping faith with something larger than himself. The practical world of banks and agricultural advisors seemed suddenly less real than the legends and mysteries that had been sleeping beneath his fields all along. Moving with sudden purpose, Michael went to the old barn. Behind stacked hay bales and rusted equipment, he found what he was looking for, the entrance to the ancient storage cellar that predated even the farmhouse itself. His grandfather had used it to store root vegetables, but it had been empty for years now. The thick stone walls and heavy oak door had protected family secrets for generations. Perhaps they could protect one more. As he carefully wrapped the sword in his grandmother's old shawl, Michael made his decision. He would keep the sword hidden, at least until he could understand more about its significance. Tommy O'Brien would help him research the old stories, find out what the markings meant. There would be risks, yes, but somehow those seemed less frightening than the risk of betraying his family's ancient trust. Back in the kitchen, he finally opened Kate's letter. His daughter's practical concerns deserved an answer, even if he couldn't tell her the whole truth yet. "The farm still has secrets to reveal," he wrote in reply. "Give me time to explore them before we make any final decisions." Outside, the stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The same stars that had watched over this land when heroes walked it, when his ancestors first took up their guardian's duty. Michael Sullivan, modern farmer, responsible businessman, and now perhaps something more, stood in his doorway and felt the weight of ages settling onto his shoulders. The choice was made. Now he had to live with the consequences, whatever they might be. The following days took on a dreamlike quality as Michael divided his time between his regular farming duties and studying the sword. Every morning, before dawn broke over the Kerry hills, he would descend into the cool darkness of the root cellar, unwrap the ancient weapon from his grandmother's shawl, and spend an hour examining its mysteries. The markings that had initially seemed random were beginning to show patterns, recurring symbols that appeared at regular intervals along the blade. Tommy O'Brien had become a frequent visitor to the farm, arriving each evening with armfuls of old books and documents from his personal collection. The old man's knowledge of local history and folklore proved invaluable as they worked to decipher the sword's secrets. They set up a makeshift research station in Michael's kitchen, spreading out Tommy's books alongside his grandmother's journal, cross-referencing ancient tales with historical records. "See here," Tommy said one evening, his weathered finger tracing a pattern on the blade. This sequence appears in the old stones at Knocknarea. It's a form of Ogham script, but older than any I've seen before. He pulled out a worn manuscript, its pages yellow with age. According to this, the Fianna had their own secret language, used to mark important locations and objects. These aren't just decorative patterns, they're messages. As they worked to understand the sword's markings, strange things began happening around the farm. The first change was subtle. The grass in the field where Michael had found the sword grew thicker and greener than anywhere else, despite receiving no special treatment. His crops in the surrounding areas began showing unusual vigor, standing, taller and stronger than they had in years. Michael noticed other changes too. The chronic pain in his back, a constant companion after years of hard farm work, had begun to ease. He felt stronger, more energetic, as if some of the sword's ancient power was flowing into the land and everything connected to it. Even his old tractor seemed to run more smoothly, though he told himself that was just his imagination. One morning, while checking the far pasture, Michael discovered a spring had appeared where none had been before. Clear, sweet water bubbled up from between the rocks, forming a small pool before trickling down toward the boggy corner where he'd found the sword. The water caught the morning light in an unusual way, seeming to shimmer with the same bluish tinge he'd noticed in the sword's metal. The old stories speak of blessed wells appearing when the land awakens, Tommy explained when Michael showed him the spring. They say Fionn mac Cumhaile's sword had the power to reveal hidden waters, to make barren land fertile again. The old man dipped his hand in the pool, tasting the water. Pure and sweet, like the ancient springs in the tales. His phone buzzed again, this time with a call from the bank. Michael let it ring out. The choice before him wasn't just about a historical artifact or his struggling farm anymore. It was about heritage, about responsibility, about keeping faith with something larger than himself. The practical world of banks and agricultural advisors seemed suddenly less real than the legends and mysteries that had been sleeping beneath his fields all along. Moving with sudden purpose, Michael went to the old barn. Behind stacked hay bales and rusted equipment, he found what he was looking for, the entrance to the ancient storage cellar that predated even the farmhouse itself. His grandfather had used it to store root vegetables, but it had been empty for years now. The thick stone walls and heavy oak door had protected family secrets for generations. Perhaps they could protect one more. As he carefully wrapped the sword in his grandmother's old shawl, Michael made his decision. He would keep the sword hidden, at least until he could understand more about its significance. Tommy O'Brien would help him research the old stories, find out what the markings meant. There would be risks, yes, but somehow those seemed less frightening than the risk of betraying his family's ancient trust. Back in the kitchen, he finally opened Kate's letter. His daughter's practical concerns deserved an answer, even if he couldn't tell her the whole truth yet. "The farm still has secrets to reveal," he wrote in reply. "Give me time to explore them before we make any final decisions." Outside, the stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, the same stars that had watched over this land when heroes walked it, when his ancestors first took up their guardian's duty. Michael Sullivan, modern farmer, responsible businessman, and now perhaps something more, stood in his doorway and felt the weight of ages settling onto his shoulders. The choice was made. Now he had to live with the consequences, whatever they might be. The following days took on a dreamlike quality as Michael divided his time between his regular farming duties and studying the sword. Every morning, before dawn broke over the Kerry hills, he would descend into the cool darkness of the root cellar, unwrap the ancient weapon from his grandmother's shawl, and spend an hour examining its mysteries. The markings that had initially seemed random were beginning to show patterns, recurring symbols that appeared at regular intervals along the blade. Tommy O'Brien had become a frequent visitor to the farm, arriving each evening with armfuls of old books and documents from his personal collection. The old man's knowledge of local history and folklore proved invaluable as they worked to decipher the sword's secrets. They set up a makeshift research station in Michael's kitchen, spreading out Tommy's books alongside his grandmother's journal, cross-referencing ancient tales with historical records. "See here," Tommy said one evening, his weathered finger tracing a pattern on the blade. "This sequence appears in the old stones at Knocknarea. It's a form of Ogham script, but older than any I've seen before." He pulled out a worn manuscript, its pages yellow with age. According to this, the Fianna had their own secret language used to mark important locations and objects. These aren't just decorative patterns, they're messages. As they worked to understand the sword's markings, strange things began happening around the farm. The first change was subtle. The grass in the field where Michael had found the sword grew thicker and greener than anywhere else, despite receiving no special treatment. His crops in the surrounding areas began showing unusual vigor, standing taller and stronger than they had in years. Michael noticed other changes too. The chronic pain in his back, a constant companion after years of hard farm work, had begun to ease. He felt stronger, more energetic, as if some of the sword's ancient power was flowing into the land and everything connected to it. Even his old tractor seemed to run more smoothly, though he told himself that was just his imagination. One morning, while checking the far pasture, Michael discovered a spring had appeared where none had been before. Clear, sweet water bubbled up from between the rocks, forming a small pool before trickling down toward the boggy corner where he'd found the sword. The water caught the morning light in an unusual way, seeming to shimmer with the same bluish tinge he'd noticed in the sword's metal. "The old stories speak of blessed wells appearing when the land awakens," Tommy explained when Michael showed him the spring. "They say Fionn Macumhail's sword had the power to reveal hidden waters, to make barren land fertile again." The old man dipped his hand in the pool, tasting the water, pure and sweet like the ancient springs in the tales. Word of the changes at Sullivan's farm began to spread through the community. Neighbors commented on how his fields were looking better than they had in years. The local agricultural cooperative took notice when his early crops came in well above expected yields. Michael deflected questions with vague references to trying new farming methods, but he could tell people were curious about the sudden transformation. Kate called more frequently now, her tone shifting from concern to cautious optimism as Michael reported the farm's improving conditions. He hadn't told her about the sword, couldn't tell her, not yet, but her latest calls had lost their urgent suggestions about selling the land. "Whatever you're doing, Dad, it seems to be working," she said. "Your last yield reports look better than anything we've studied at university." But it was during one of his early morning sessions with the sword that Michael experienced something that left no doubt about its power. As usual, he had taken it from its hiding place and unwrapped it carefully. The first rays of dawn were just beginning to filter through the cellar's narrow window when his hand brushed against one of the symbols near the hilt. The marking began to glow with a soft blue light, and suddenly the cellar around him seemed to fade away. He found himself standing on the same land, but in a different time. Warriors in ancient dress moved across the fields, their weapons glinting in the sun. At their head strode a tall figure, wielding a sword that shone with the same blue light as the one in Michael's hands. The vision was gone in an instant, but it left him shaking with its intensity. Tommy wasn't surprised when Michael described his experience. "The sword is showing you what it wants you to see," the old man said. "In the old days, they said Fionn's blade could part the veil between times, show glimpses of what was and what might be. But why it's showing you these particular visions, that's what we need to understand." Michael spent hours transcribing every detail of his vision into a notebook, alongside their ongoing translations of the sword's markings. Patterns were emerging, references. To ancient battles, yes, but also to healing, to renewal, to the awakening of dormant powers in the land. The sword, it seemed, was more than just a weapon. It was a key to something larger, something that had been sleeping beneath these fields for centuries. The bank had stopped calling, perhaps satisfied by the improved condition of the farm and Michael's ability to make his recent payments on time. But he knew this period of relative calm was just the beginning. The sword's appearance, the changes in his land, the visions, they all pointed to something approaching, something that would demand more of him than simply being a caretaker of ancient secrets. As spring deepened into early summer, Michael could feel the momentum building. Each morning brought new growth, new strength to his fields. Each evening spent studying with Tommy revealed new layers of meaning in the swords. Mysterious script. He was no longer simply preserving his family's farm. He was participating in the awakening of something ancient and powerful, but even as hope and wonder filled his days, a shadow of anxiety lurked at the edges of his mind. Such power rarely came without a price, and the old stories Tommy shared were full of warnings about the responsibilities and dangers that came with awakening ancient magic. Michael couldn't help but wonder what challenges lay ahead, what tests he would face as the sword's chosen guardian. For now, though, he focused on documenting every change, every sign, every piece of the growing mystery. The sword had chosen this time to reveal itself for a reason. All he could do was prepare himself for whatever was coming and hope he would prove worthy of the trust placed in him by both his ancestors and the ancient power stirring beneath. His fields, the peace of early summer, was shattered one stormy morning when Michael discovered footprints in the mud near the root cellar. Someone had been prowling around his farm in the night, paying particular attention to the old barn and its hidden chamber. His heart raced as he followed the tracks which led to the cellar door before disappearing into the wet grass. That same day, a sleek black car pulled up to his farm gate. Two men in expensive suits emerged, introducing themselves as representatives from a private antiquities collection. They spoke with polished Dublin accents and carried leather briefcases that seemed out of place in the muddy farmyard. "We've heard rumors," the taller one said, "about certain artifacts being discovered in this area. We're prepared to make a very generous offer for any items of historical significance." Michael's blood ran cold. He hadn't told anyone about the sword except Tommy, and he trusted the old man with his life. Yet somehow, word had gotten out. He denied any knowledge of archaeological finds, but he could tell by their knowing smiles that they didn't believe him. As they left, the shorter man handed him a business card with a phone number and an eye-watering sum written on the back. That evening, when Tommy arrived for their usual research session, Michael shared his concerns. The old man's face grew grave. "There have always been those who seek the old powers for their own gain," he said, his voice low and urgent. "The sword's awakening sends ripples through the world that certain people can feel. We must be more careful," but careful wasn't enough. Over the next few days, more strangers appeared at the farm. Some were obvious treasure hunters, barely bothering to disguise their interest. Others were more subtle, a lost hiker asking to look around the property, a journalist wanting to write about traditional farming methods. Each time, Michael felt their hungry eyes searching his land, looking for signs of the power they could sense but couldn't quite locate. The situation took a darker turn when Michael began experiencing intense headaches and vivid nightmares. In his dreams, he saw armies clashing on his fields, the sword burning with blue fire as dark forces tried to claim it. He would wake in a cold sweat, the sword's markings pulsing with an urgent light in its hiding place below. Tommy's research revealed a disturbing pattern. "The sword's guardians have faced trials like this before," he explained, showing Michael an ancient text. "When the power awakens, it attracts both light and shadow. The sword tests its guardian's resolve before revealing its full purpose." The pressure began to affect Michael's health. He lost weight, dark circles formed under his eyes, and his hands shook as he performed his daily farm work. The very energy that had been healing his land seemed to be draining him, as if the sword was demanding proof of his commitment to its cause. Kate noticed the change in their weekly video calls. "Dad, you look terrible," she said, her face creased with worry. "I'm coming home this weekend. Whatever's going on, you don't have to handle it alone." Michael wanted to tell her everything, but how could he explain what he himself barely understood? The breaking point came when Michael found the root cellar door broken open one night. The intruders had left empty-handed. He had taken to carrying the sword with him everywhere, but the violation of his sanctuary hit him hard. That same night, a fever took hold of him, burning through his body like fire. As he lay in his bed, delirious with fever, the sword's markings began to glow with an intensity he'd never seen before. Through his fever-hazed vision, Michael saw figures moving in his bedroom, shadows of ancient warriors, whispers in a language he didn't understand but somehow knew. The sword was trying to tell him something, show him something, but the message was lost in the storm of his illness. His last conscious thought before the fever took him completely was a desperate prayer that he would prove strong enough for whatever test this was. The sword that had brought such promise now seemed to be bringing destruction. As Michael's consciousness faded in and out, he couldn't help but wonder if he had made a terrible mistake in keeping it. Perhaps some powers were better left sleeping in the earth, some secrets better left buried in time. But even as these doubts plagued his fevered mind, he knew it was too late to turn back. The sword had chosen him, and whatever the cost, he would have to see this journey through to its end. Kate Sullivan arrived at the farm to find her father burning with fever in his bedroom, muttering about swords and ancient warriors. The house was dark and cold, unusual for the typically well-maintained Sullivan home. She immediately called Dr. Murphy, the local physician who had treated 3 generations of Sullivans, but something told her this was beyond ordinary medical help. As she waited for the doctor, Kate noticed strange details around the house. Her father's usually orderly kitchen was covered in old books and papers, many written in languages she didn't recognize. Unusual symbols had been sketched on numerous pages, along with notes in her father's increasingly erratic handwriting. Most puzzling was a rough drawing of a sword, repeatedly sketched with obsessive detail. Dr. Murphy arrived quickly, his ancient Land Rover churning up mud in the farm's driveway. The elderly doctor had been treating the Sullivans since before Kate was born, and his concerned expression deepened as he examined Michael. "This is no ordinary fever," he said, putting away his stethoscope. "I've seen something like this before, years ago, when your grandfather—" He stopped abruptly, sharing a meaningful look with Tommy O'Brien, who had appeared silently in the doorway. Kate hadn't even heard the old historian arrive, but somehow his presence seemed expected, necessary even. The 2 elderly men stepped into the hallway, speaking in hushed tones that Kate strained to hear. "It's happening again, then?" Dr. Murphy asked. "It is," Tommy replied, "but this time it's different. The power is stronger, and so are those who would claim it." "Does she know?" "Not yet, but she needs to. She's part of this too." Kate stepped into the hallway, her patience exhausted. "I'm right here," she said firmly, "and I need to know what's happening to my father." The 2 old men exchanged glances. Again, before Tommy nodded slowly. "It's time," he said. "Girl, what do you know about your family's true history?" What followed was a story that should have seemed impossible, but somehow resonated with memories Kate had almost forgotten. Her grandmother's tales of ancient warriors, her father's insistence on maintaining old traditions, the strange feelings she'd always had about their land. Tommy spoke of guardians and sacred trusts, of powers sleeping in the earth, and of a sword that was more than just a weapon. "Your father found it," Tommy explained, "as it was foretold. But the power is overwhelming. Him because he's trying to bear it alone. The sword was never meant to have a single guardian. It needs the strength of the whole bloodline." Dr. Murphy added his own knowledge, explaining how he'd seen similar symptoms in Kate's grandfather years ago during what the family had called a nervous breakdown, but was apparently something far different. "Your grandfather was searching for it too," he said. "The fever came when he got close. But he didn't have what your father has, the sword itself, and you." Kate's mind reeled as pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed fell into place. The strange dreams she'd had at University of Ancient Battles, the unexpected talent she'd shown for traditional farming methods, her inexplicable reluctance to see the farm sold, all of it suddenly made sense. "Where is it?" she asked. "The sword. Where does he keep it?" Tommy led them to the root cellar, but the sword wasn't there. Following some instinct she didn't understand, Kate went to her father's room. There, wrapped in her grandmother's shawl and clutched in her father's fevered hands, lay the ancient weapon. As she approached, the sword's markings began to glow with a soft blue light. When Kate touched the hilt, something extraordinary happened. The fever flush in her father's cheeks began to fade, and his breathing eased. The sword's glow steadied, becoming warmer and more constant. She felt energy flowing through her, not overwhelming like it had been for her father, but controlled, balanced. "The sword recognizes its own," Tommy said softly. "It needs both of you, the old guardian and the new, past and future, working together. This was never a burden meant to be carried alone." Over the next few days, as Michael slowly recovered, father and daughter began to work together to understand their shared legacy. Kate's academic knowledge of agricultural history, combined with her father's deep connection to the land, proved to be a powerful combination. The sword's markings, which had been puzzling Michael for weeks, began to make more sense when Kate applied her university research methods to Tommy's historical records. The mysterious visitors who had been plaguing the farm ceased their attempts to approach. Something in the renewed energy of the place seemed to warn them away. The sword's power, now properly balanced between two guardians, strengthened the land's ancient protections. Dr. Murphy became a regular visitor, sharing medical knowledge that had been passed down through generations of local healers. He spoke of the old ways of healing that worked with the land's energy, techniques that had been dismissed as folklore, but were proving remarkably effective when combined with the sword's power. The fever had broken not just Michael's illness, but also the isolation that had nearly destroyed him. As father and daughter worked together, supported by the wisdom of Tommy and Dr. Murphy, the true purpose of the sword's appearance began to become clear. It wasn't just about preserving the past, it was about building a bridge to the future, combining ancient power with new knowledge. Kate postponed her return to university, knowing her education could continue here in ways no conventional schooling could match. There were mysteries still to unravel, powers still to understand, and challenges still to face, but now they would face them together, as the sword had always intended. The first signs of true transformation began on a misty morning in late summer. Michael and Kate stood at the edge of the boggy field where the sword had first been discovered, watching as the sun broke through the clouds. The sword, now carried in a specially crafted leather sheath that Tommy had provided, hung at Michael's side while Kate held their grandmother's journal, its pages filled with new notes and observations. "There's something different about the air today," Kate said, her academic skepticism giving way to the intuition that seemed to grow stronger each day. The morning mist indeed had an unusual quality. It swirled in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, forming and reforming shapes that reminded them of the symbols on the sword's blade. Michael drew the sword, its metal gleaming with that distinctive bluish tinge they'd come to know so well. As he held it point down toward the earth, the ground beneath their feet began to hum with a subtle vibration. Kate quickly opened the journal, ready to document whatever was about to happen. The mist gathered more thickly around them, and within it they began to see images, not the vague suggestions of their imaginations, but clear pictures as if projected on the air itself. They saw their land as it had been centuries ago, when the Fianna warriors had used it as their training ground. The images shifted, showing how the ancient warriors had worked with the land's natural energy, not just for combat, but for healing, for growing, for maintaining the delicate balance between the human and the other world. As they watched, transfixed, the sword's markings began to glow with increasing intensity. The light spread from the blade into the ground, following the ancient ley lines that crisscrossed their property. Where the light touched, the land seemed to awaken. The boggy soil began to firm and sweeten, decades of stagnant water draining away through newly opened channels in the earth. It's not just making the land fertile, Kate realized, frantically writing in the journal. It's restoring it to what it was meant to be, what it was when the Fianna were here. Her agricultural training helped her understand what she was seeing. The soil structure changing, mineral balances shifting, beneficial organisms multiplying. Michael felt the sword's power flowing through him, but this time it wasn't overwhelming. With Kate beside him, the energy found its proper balance. He understood now why the sword had appeared when it did, not just because the farm was in trouble, but because the time had come for old knowledge and new understanding to work together. The transformation spread outward from where they stood like ripples in a pond. The sickly yellow grass began to green and strengthen. Ancient springs, long buried, bubbled up to the surface, their water crystal clear and sweet. The very air seemed to become cleaner, charged with the same vital energy that had made this place special to their ancestors. Tommy O'Brien arrived just as the mist was beginning to clear, his timing as impeccable as ever. The old man stood in awe at the edge of the field, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "I've waited my whole life to see this," he whispered. The old stories spoke of it, the great awakening when the land would remember itself. The changes weren't limited to their own property. Neighboring farms reported mysterious improvements in their soil and water quality. Crops began growing with unusual vigor, livestock showed increased health and vitality, and the whole region seemed to be experiencing a subtle but undeniable renaissance. Word spread quickly through the farming community. Agricultural experts arrived to study the phenomenon, though Kate and Michael were careful to keep the sword's existence secret. The experts' instruments recorded remarkable improvements in soil composition, water quality, and atmospheric conditions, but couldn't explain the cause. Kate's university professors were particularly interested, though her carefully worded research papers never mentioned ancient magic or glowing swords. That evening, as the three of them sat in the kitchen reviewing Kate's notes, Tommy shared another piece of ancient lore. "The sword isn't just a weapon or a tool," he explained. "It's a key that unlocks the land's memory. The Fianna knew that the earth itself holds wisdom, power, and healing. They didn't just live on the land, they lived with it as partners in a sacred trust. Michael and Kate's work with the sword had only begun. Each day brought new discoveries, new understanding of how to blend ancient wisdom with modern knowledge. The sword's markings, they learned, weren't just decorative or historical. They were instructions, a manual for working with the land's natural energies. The bank calls had stopped entirely now. The farm's impressive productivity spoke for itself, and there was even talk of establishing a research center for sustainable agriculture on their land. Kate's professors were eager to study their innovative farming methods, though they remained puzzled by the unprecedented results. As summer deepened toward autumn, father and daughter established a routine. Mornings were spent working with the sword, learning to direct and balance its energy. Afternoons were for conventional farm work, now remarkably easier with the land's renewed vitality. Evenings were devoted to study, with Tommy sharing his vast knowledge of local history and folklore, while Kate applied her academic research skills to understanding the sword's deeper mysteries. The mysterious visitors who had plagued them earlier seemed to have given up their pursuit, perhaps sensing that the sword's power was now properly anchored and protected. The land itself had become a guardian, its restored energy creating subtle but effective barriers against those with ill intent. What had begun as a desperate discovery in a boggy field had transformed into something far greater, a revival of ancient knowledge, a restoration of natural balance, and most importantly, the renewal of the deep bond between the land and its guardians. The sword had indeed brought them a treasure beyond imagination, but not in the way anyone could have expected. The revelation came on the autumn equinox, a date that Tommy had been anticipating with growing excitement. The old texts speak of times when the veil between worlds grows thin, he had explained, spreading ancient manuscripts across the kitchen table. The equinox was sacred to the Fianna, a time when the sword's full purpose could be understood. As the sun set that evening, Michael and Kate stood in the center of their rejuvenated land, the sword held between them. The blade's markings had been growing steadily brighter as the day progressed, and now they shone with an intensity that illuminated the gathering dusk. Tommy stood nearby, clutching their grandmother's journal, ready to record whatever might happen. The last ray of sunlight caught the sword's edge, and suddenly the air around them shifted. The mist that had become familiar during their morning. Work with the sword returned, but this time it formed a perfect circle around them. Within its bounds, they could see layers of time overlapping, ancient warriors training on the same ground where they stood. Druids working with the land's energy, their own ancestors maintaining the sacred trust through generations. But it was more than just visions this time. The sword's markings began to move, shifting and rearranging themselves on the blade. What had seemed like decorative patterns suddenly revealed themselves as a complex text, a message left by Fionn McCumhale himself, meant only for those who proved worthy of understanding it. "The sword is not the treasure," Kate read aloud, her voice trembling as the ancient words somehow became clear to her. "It is the key to the treasure, the knowledge of how to live in harmony with the land's power. This wisdom was not lost. It was hidden, waiting for those who would understand its true value." Michael felt a surge of understanding. The sword had never been meant as a weapon of war, but as a tool of healing and renewal. The Fianna warriors hadn't just been fighters. They had been guardians of an ancient understanding of how to work with the natural world's own energy and power. The mysterious visitors who had tried to claim the sword would never have unlocked its true potential. They had sought it as a source of power over the land, when its real purpose was to teach cooperation with the land. The sword had chosen the Sullivans not because they were warriors, but because they had maintained their connection to the earth through generations of faithful stewardship. As these revelations unfolded, the sword's light spread outward, illuminating the entire farm. They could see the network of ancient energy lines clearly now, understanding how they connected their land to other sacred sites across Ireland. Their small farm wasn't just a plot of agricultural land. It was a crucial point in an ancient system of natural power and healing. Tommy's voice shook with emotion as he documented everything in the journal. "This is what the old stories meant," he said. "The treasure of the Fianna wasn't gold or magical weapons. It was this knowledge, this understanding of how to work with the land itself. And you too, you've proven worthy of it." The sword's light began to fade as the first stars appeared, but the understanding remained. Kate and Michael looked at each other, overwhelmed by the responsibility and possibility of what they had learned. Their family's role as guardians hadn't just been about protecting a sword or a piece of land. It was about preserving the possibility of this moment, when ancient wisdom could be reawakened and applied to the modern world's needs. This isn't just about saving our farm anymore, is it? Kate asked, though she already knew the answer. Michael shook his head. No, it's about showing others the way. The sword found us because we needed its help, but also because the world needs this knowledge again. As they walked back to the farmhouse, the magnitude of their discovery settled over them. They were no longer just farmers struggling to save their family land. They had become custodians of something far more precious, the understanding of how to restore harmony between human needs and natural power. The sword had indeed brought them a treasure beyond imagination, but not in the form of gold or magic. It had given them something far more valuable, the knowledge of their true heritage and the means to help heal not just their own land, but to show others the way as well. Word of the Sullivan farm's extraordinary transformation spread far beyond their small community in Kerry. Agricultural experts from universities across Europe began arriving to study what they called the Sullivan phenomenon. The farm's soil showed unprecedented levels of fertility, its water tested purer than any natural source in the region, and the crops yielded harvests that defied conventional explanation. Dr. Elena Martinez, a leading expert in sustainable agriculture from the University of Barcelona, was the first to recognize something truly revolutionary in their methods. What the Sullivans have achieved here goes beyond organic farming or traditional techniques, she announced at a prestigious agricultural conference. They've somehow tapped into principles of land management that we're only beginning to understand. Kate's professors at the Dublin Agricultural College were particularly intrigued. Her research papers on traditional Irish farming methods, carefully worded to exclude any mention of ancient swords or magical powers, were gaining attention in academic circles. She spoke of inherited wisdom and regenerative techniques, translating their supernatural experiences into language the scientific community could accept. Michael found himself hosting delegations of farmers from across Ireland and beyond, all eager to learn their methods. He and Kate had developed a careful way of demonstrating their techniques without revealing the sword's existence. They spoke of ancient farming wisdom, of working with the land's natural energy, of understanding the deeper patterns of growth and renewal. Watch how the morning mist moves across the fields, Michael would explain to his visitors. The old stories say it shows you where the energy flows. He didn't mention that he and Kate used the sword's guidance to see these patterns clearly, but even without its visible glow, others could begin to sense the special nature of the land. The farm became a center for what the media called the New Irish Agricultural Revolution. Journalists wrote glowing articles about the return to traditional methods yielding modern results. Environmental scientists praised their water conservation techniques and soil regeneration methods. Economic analysts noted how the Sullivan model could revitalize struggling agricultural communities. One crisp autumn morning, a particularly distinguished visitor arrived at the farm. Dr. Oife O'Brien, Ireland's leading archaeologist and historian, had been intrigued by references in Kate's academic papers to ancient agricultural practices. She arrived unannounced, her keen eyes taking in every detail of the transformed landscape. "There are stories," she said, sitting at their kitchen table, "of how the Fianna warriors weren't just fighters. They were custodians of a deeper knowledge, about working with the land." Her gaze was sharp as she studied Michael and Kate's reactions. "The patterns in your fields match designs found on ancient stone markers across Ireland. Your water management system follows the same principles we've discovered in prehistoric farming sites. Michael and Kate shared a look, wondering how much they could safely reveal. Tommy, who had appointed himself their unofficial advisor in such matters, had taught them to be cautious but not dismissive of those who might understand. Dr. O'Brien continued, pulling out a worn leather notebook. I've spent my career studying the intersection of Irish mythology and historical fact. The old tales speak of sacred sites where the power of the land was particularly strong, places where ancient wisdom was preserved for future generations. She opened the notebook, revealing sketches of symbols that looked remarkably like those on their sword. These marks appear on sacred sites across Ireland, she explained. They're part of a system we're only beginning to understand. And somehow, you've managed to implement that system here, bringing it back to life in a way that's measurable, demonstrable, and repeatable. Kate felt a familiar warmth at her side, the sword, hidden beneath her jacket, responding to the historian's words. Dr. O'Brien's eyes widened slightly, and Kate realized the woman had noticed something. But instead of pushing for answers, she simply nodded. There are some mysteries, she said carefully, that are best understood gradually. What matters is that you're proving something I've long suspected. The ancient Irish didn't just work the land, they worked with it. They understood principles we're only now rediscovering. She pulled out a business card. When you're ready to share more of what you've learned, I hope you'll consider collaborating with my research team. As she left, Michael and Kate felt a weight lift from their shoulders. They had found an ally who understood enough to know what questions not to ask, who could help bridge the gap between their ancient knowledge and the modern world's need for explanation. The sword's power had brought them more than just agricultural success. It had positioned them to help restore a lost understanding of humanity's relationship with the natural world. Their small farm was becoming a beacon of hope, showing how ancient wisdom could help solve modern problems. That evening, as they checked the sword's hiding place in the root cellar, its markings glowed with what seemed like approval. They were walking a careful line between revealing and protecting their secret, but somehow they knew they were on the right path. The sword had chosen them not just to preserve its power, but to help share its wisdom in ways the modern world could understand and accept. 1 year after discovering the sword, Michael stood at the edge of his transformed land, tears welling in his eyes as he surveyed what had once been a struggling farm. The morning mist swirled with that now familiar bluish tinge, dancing across fields so vibrant they seemed to glow with their own inner light. Kate stood beside him, their grandmother's journal in her hands, its pages now filled with their own discoveries and insights. The sword, safely hidden but never far from reach, had changed everything. What had begun as a desperate farmer's discovery had blossomed into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. The Sullivan farm had become more than just a successful agricultural venture. It was now a center for learning, healing, and the revival of ancient wisdom. Dr. O'Brien's research team had carefully documented the extraordinary changes in the land, publishing papers that sent ripples through the scientific community. The Sullivan method, as it came to be known, was being studied and implemented on farms across Ireland and beyond. While the sword remained their secret, its wisdom was transforming modern agriculture in ways that bridged the gap between past and present. Kate had completed her degree, earning highest honors for her groundbreaking research on traditional Irish farming techniques. Her work, combining ancient wisdom with modern science, had earned her international recognition. Universities were offering her research positions, but she had chosen to stay on the farm, knowing her true work was here. The mysterious visitors, who had once threatened their peace, were long gone, perhaps sensing that the sword's power was now properly anchored in the land and its guardians. The farm's natural protections, strengthened by the sword's energy and the Sullivans' deepening understanding, kept unwanted attention at bay while welcoming those who came with genuine desire to learn. Tommy O'Brien still visited daily, his role evolving from keeper of secrets to teacher of ancient wisdom. His vast knowledge of local history and folklore had proved invaluable in understanding the sword's messages, and now he helped Michael and Kate share that knowledge with others in ways that honored both the old traditions and the new understanding. The bank manager who had once threatened foreclosure now pointed to Sullivan Farm as a model of sustainable agriculture. The same development companies that had pressured Michael to sell now sent representatives to learn from their methods. The farm's success had sparked a revival of traditional farming across the region, helping other families maintain their ancestral lands while embracing a more harmonious relationship with the natural world. But beyond the material success, the greatest transformation had been in the Sullivans themselves. Michael was no longer just a struggling farmer, but a guardian of ancient wisdom, helping others reconnect with the land's deep magic. Kate had found her true calling, bridging the worlds of academic knowledge and ancestral understanding. Together, they had discovered that their family's legacy was far richer and more important than they had ever imagined. As Michael watched the morning sun rise over his flourishing fields, he remembered that first moment of discovery, when his plough had struck something solid in the boggy earth. The sword had seemed like a miracle then, a possible salvation for his failing farm. Now he understood it had been something far more significant, a key to unlocking not just the land's potential, but humanity's forgotten understanding of how to live in harmony with the natural world. At this point in our story, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever discovered something that completely changed your life's direction? How do you think ancient wisdom could help solve modern problems? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The sword's power continued to pulse through the land, a constant reminder of the trust placed in them. But its greatest gift hadn't been the magical transformation of their farm. It had been the revelation of a deeper truth that had always been there, waiting to be rediscovered. The Sullivans had become more than guardians of a magical sword. They were now custodians of hope, showing others that the wisdom of the past could light the way to a better future. The ancient blade that had once been carried by legendary warriors now served a different but equally vital purpose. Through the Sullivans' careful stewardship, it was helping to forge a new path forward, one that honored both progress and tradition, science and magic, the wisdom of the past and the needs of the present. If you enjoyed this incredible journey of discovery and transformation, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing true stories that will inspire and amaze you. Hit the notification bell to never miss an upload. Sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the most unexpected places, and the most powerful magic lies not in the artifacts we discover, but in how we choose to use them. For Michael and Kate Sullivan, a mysterious sword had unlocked not just the secrets of their land, but the true purpose of their family's legacy, a legacy that would continue to grow and transform lives for generations to come. Thank you for joining us on this extraordinary journey. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most incredible stories are the ones waiting to be discovered in your own backyard. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you in the next video.